Everything in the world which is physical is a reflection of a spiritual reality, a spiritual underpinning, a spiritual event or philosophy, and that is expressed or concretized, crystallized as a physical reality. The desert represents the concept of wilderness. What does that mean? Wilderness means shimama. Shimama means purposelessness. To walk in the wilderness without any markers, without any landmarks, without any direction, seeing mirages, is a place of wanton, purposeless wandering. It's a state of being which is the opposite of direction and destiny. This state is also represented, this idea of wandering aimlessly without direction, is represented by that which we find in the wilderness, the nachash. The nachash, the root word of nachash, the snake in the Garden of Eden, which is also found in the desert. The root word is, says Rav Moshe Marevi, chush. Nachash comes from the word chush, which means feelings, emotions. When we are governed by our chush, we become a nachash. We are given into our primordial Garden of Eden snake within ourselves. The evil inclination, which is not evil as in bad, but ra as in ra'ua, shaky. Our emotions are shaky. Our emotions are enlightened and piqued and animated by our amygdala. The amygdala is part of the brain which governs the emotions. Reasoning is governed by the prefrontal cortex, the thought patterns over here. But the amygdala behind us is wild, and it sends out a message to the brain saying danger, and we get emotionally upset, and we become people who are wandering aimlessly, giving over ourselves to our emotions, anger, hurt, sadness, crying, rudeness, upsetness, frustration, depression, because the amygdala is firing on all cylinders in our emotional self. The brain sends out a signal saying there is difficulty, there is danger, and we react with emotional wantonness, emotional recklessness, emotional wilderness, like a midbar, undirected, unpurposed. That is the idea of the connection between the midbar and the nachash. The wilderness and the chush, the emotions, drive us in a place of emptiness. Both symbolizing midbar and nachash represents physicality and not spirituality. The nachash and the desert challenge us. Wilderness challenges us to decide whether we want to live by our amygdala, our emotional self, or by our prefrontal cortex to think that there is a God who is guiding us. The desert, as the nachash, the snake, obscures the goal and destiny. It leads us to a state of wandering for the sake of wandering, purposelessness, directionless. The Jewish people's wandering in the desert, in Maseh, the 42 encampments that we accomplished and experienced in the desert, was a reenactment of the choice of Adam HaRishon in the Garden of Eden to listen to the primordial nachash, the primordial chush within himself, to listen to wilderness within himself. Adam created wilderness with himself, and we created wilderness by doing the two great sins of the golden calf and bringing back a negative report of the spies. Once Adam made his choice, he introduced to the world a pathway of directionless wandering, life without purpose. If man desires this pathway, God will allow us to follow this pathway. Because Gemara Makos 10b says, in the way in which we want to go, that's the way in which we are led. Adam had an internal desire to follow his own pathway. He said, it's too easy to serve God out of my prefrontal cortex to see God's greatness. I want to serve God out of dilemma, out of wilderness, and overcome my wilderness within me, my chush within me, and then still serve God. God did not ask him to do that. He wanted to follow his way. Because he desired that lechatchila, God let him follow that pathway. In the way that we want to go, we desire to go, God allows us to go. That's the ultimate in free will. If man desires to wander aimlessly through life, God will allow us to wander aimlessly through life. The test of wandering in the desert, in the 42 encampments in the desert, is resolved, is misukan, is fixed, only when we find our way toward our original destination. We get back on track. As Ramchal tells us in the very first words of the path of the just, Mesilas Yesharim, he says, Yesod ha-chasidus v'shoresh ha-avodah, the foundation of piety and the root of perfect service of God, hu sheyisbarer v'yisames eitzel ha'adam ma chovaso be'olamo, that a man should strive to clarify and come to realize the truth as to what is his obligation in his world. Ma chovaso be'olamo. It does not say ma chovaso be'olam, his obligation in the world. It says ma chovaso be'olamo. Each person is a world unto yourself. Each person is a world unto himself and herself. And therefore each person has an obligation in your world. Ma chovaso be'olamo. You have a particular mission to accomplish in your world. That's your destiny, that's your pathway, and you have to follow that pathway. There is wilderness, but there is pathway. It's our choice to follow the pathway, either to follow the pathway of the will of Hashem, the will of God, to achieve our destiny, or to wander aimlessly after our chush, after our desires, after our emotions, and wander aimlessly and directionless in this world. And says the Ramchal, the foundation of piety and the root of perfect service of God is for man to clarify and come to realize as truth what is his obligation in his world, and to what he needs to direct his gaze and his aspiration in all that he toils all the days of his life. Ma chovaso ba'olamo ulemat tzarich sheyasi mabato umegamaso b'chol asher hu amel kol yimei chayav. So the true identity, our true identity, is to have our heavenly soul self guide our earthly wilderness self. Our shamayim self has to guide our midbar self toward destiny, toward self-actualization, which can only be by following and becoming in the image of God. That is to reconnect our chush with our spiritual source. And that is to take our chush, our emotional self, and elevate it to the prefrontal cortex to serve Hashem. Not to take the chush and to go down into gravity, into the body, into the wilderness, and be purposeless and follow our desires and our emotions and let them take over and guide our lives with artzius, with chomrius, with materialism and wilderness, but to elevate it up here through the power of tzelem elokim. Tzelem elokim means free will. To use tzelem elokim, free will, and to, in a free will fashion, take our chush and sublimate it, our emotions, and sublimate them to the prefrontal cortex, to the intellect, by following the intellect of God. The question is, am I going to follow my intellect or the intellect of God? My seichel or the seichel eloki? That is the battle of the wilderness and shamayim. So the word wilderness is shimama, desolation, shimama, and the antidote is shamayim. Unbelievable idea. The wilderness of shimama, of the midbar, of the wilderness, is answered by the shamayim, the direction of the heavenly direction of shamayim. And the word shamayim means destiny. The root word of shamayim is sham, there. Shamayim is plural, which means I am going to shamayim. Doesn't mean heaven where there are winged, floppy angels floating around with harps and music playing. That's not what heaven is. Shamayim means sham, there. Shamayim is plural of there, which means the there of all the theirs, which means the destiny of self-actualization. That's what shamayim is. Shamayim is the becoming the best person I can become through my chesed, through my giving, through my self-control, through my kindness, through my resilience, and in that way become the best person I can become, and then I'll live in that spiritual force field forever in the world to come. That's my there. That's my there of all theirs. That's my shamayim. But there is a shemama, there is a desolation which follows me. There is a desolation which urges me to follow my chush, my wilderness self. And that's the battle of trying to find a derech, a pathway in the wilderness. If we lose our direction in the shmama, in the desolation and wilderness, we will never arrive sham, there, in shamayim. If we enter the world of emptiness and purposelessness, a world of tuma does not mean impurity. Tuma means spiritual blockage, which means physicality. The opposite of spirituality is physicality. Tuma means to be blocked. Tahara means spiritually open. I want to be spiritually open, that my neshama should be open to the prefrontal cortex to use my free will to serve God rather than to serve my emotional self, my amygdala, and to walk into the desert of desolate purposelessness. The Jewish people entered slavery in Egypt, in Mitzrayim, and were redeemed from darkness to light. They were given, therefore, the blueprint of the Torah, the blueprint of life on Har Sinai, to use to guide them from darkness to light in the wilderness, in the desert. However, after 40 days of hearing Hashem speak on Mount Sinai, they plunged once again into darkness, into desolateness, into purposelessness by building a golden calf as a symbol of power of God. God does not want any symbols of power. He wants a direct relationship with us, a direct free will relationship with us. He doesn't want any intermediaries. He wants us each to pick up our spiritual phone and to connect with him through tefillah, through yearning, through learning. Each one has the power. What an unbelievable confidence Hashem has in each of us that we can directly connect to the source of the universe. We can directly talk to the boss of all bosses, the chairman of the board. A non-Jewish woman came up to me in an airport and said, "So you don't believe in our man?" I said, "No, I don't." She said, "Why not?" I said, "Because we don't believe in intermediaries." She said, "Well, it's too daunting to reach God himself. You need an intermediary." I said, "Why? Pick up the phone and talk to God directly. You are made in the Tzelem Elohim." No, it's too much, she said. It's too much. You have to have an intermediary to speak on our behalf. No, I said, we don't. God created us, each of us, in the image of God, and you too, I said to her. And you can just open your heart and talk to God directly. No, she said, it's too much. That's not the message. The message is that we have to open our hearts and have a pure, direct connection with our source, because we emanate from the source. We are an emanation. We are an extension. We are an expression of God's breath, an expression of God's image. And we had that opportunity, but we failed when we built this intermediary, this golden calf. Again, plunged back into darkness, being blinded by the darkness of the ego, of desire for power, for an image of power, and not having a direct connection with the power of the universe, the creator of the universe himself. We did tshuva. We were forgiven, and yet plunged again into darkness when we came back with a negative report of the land of Israel. As a spy said, we cannot conquer this land. And so again, because we were plunged into darkness, we had to wander 40 years. 40 years in the desert in exchange for 40 days of touring the land of Israel. Midah Keneged Midah, 40 years to rectify the mistake of not believing that Hashem could help us. That's what Emunah means. Emunah, faith in God, means I believe in the God who believes in me. Of course we believe in God. We didn't create this universe. It's not possible to have created cicadas. Can you look at that insect with red eyes and wings that comes out of the shell, flies around for 6 weeks, and then dies and propagates and comes and then plants eggs, lays eggs that are buried in the soil for 17 years, eats tree roots and come out 17 years later? Could you imagine such a thing? Who could think of such a thing? And the reasons for them are that they help certain types of trees, and they help certain things we have no knowledge about. And the appendix, we think it's superfluous, but there is a reason for the appendix. And there are so many things that we think are not necessary, but Hashem knows the plan. When we think we know better, that's called darkness. That's called desert. That's called purposelessness. And we go to the Midbar, wilderness, which is a place without dibur, a place without a dabar, without a leader. It's wilderness unless we create leadership and appoint Moshe Rabbeinu as our leader to guide us to the promised land. The Sfas Emes goes deeper. He teaches that the wanderings in the desert served as a tikkun, as a rectification of the sin of the golden calf and of the 10 spies. The suffering of the desert, the sufferings of wandering throughout the desert for 40 years, was a preparation for their entry into Eretz Yisrael, the land, which represents the main destination of man. That is a place where we plant, we plant seeds, we nurture our plants, we harvest them, and we thank God for the harvest. We pray to him. There is no drought. That is the destination. Destination of man is to plant seeds and to pray to God and to have a relationship with God in Eretz Yisrael. The destination is not to live only in miracle of the desert with man, with manna, and with a well which walked with us throughout the desert and clouds of glory. That was a moment of protection to get us to the promised land. But that's not the goal. Zelohan muvukash, as Moshe would say. What is asked of us is to go to Eretz Yisrael and to plant and to pray and to connect with God. So being in the desert for 40 years itself was the sublimation of the ego that God runs the world, and is their willingness to follow God with absolute submission in the wilderness that rectified their misguided egos of the building of the golden calf and the 10 spies, bringing back a negative report. It was the desert itself which did not lead to Eretz Yisrael. It led to a sublimation of conscious ego to the will of God. We recognize that in the miracles, God runs the show. God runs water and food, the manna, and our steps, our guidance of divine providence, the cloud. And we gave over ourselves our ego that we aggrandized with the power of the golden calf and the power of the 10 spies who said, we know better. And that had to be rectified by 40 years of wandering the desert to say, no, my ego belongs to Hashem. Once they were able to do that, they were deserving of entering into the land of Israel. Just as on Shabbos, we sublimate our creative power. We stop creating because we plug into the source of all creation, the power of the Creator, and we become therefore more creative by sublimating our creativity to his mastery of the world. So too, following Hashem in the wilderness in the Midbar served as a tikkun, a rectification of their ego will, their wilderness will, and allowed them to get back on track on their journey. El Aretz Asher Areka, that Avram Avinu was given and told, I will take you to the land which I will show you. They were errant. They did not make it because they made a mistake with the golden calf and the spies. And now through the rectification of the Midbar, they got back on track on the El Aretz Asher Areka that was begun by Lech Lecha, by God's command to Avram Avinu. It was not that they found their way after they suffered in the desert. Rather, the suffering itself was the sublimation, the bitul of their will. Bitul does not mean you are nothing. It means you take everything that you have and you mevatel it to God. That does not make you nothing. Batel, it's batel of your will. You mevatel your will to God. That makes you everything. That makes you connected to everything. Therefore, the darkness of the Midbar, the darkness of the desert, did not lead to light. Rather, the darkness became light. their ego was transformed into batel, to the will of Hashem. The wilderness was not something which then they got punished and therefore they rectified and then they deserved Eretz Yisrael. Rather, the process of midbar, of wilderness, was to sublimate their will and to change and transform them from ego-based people, wilderness-based people, to people who served Hashem and followed the light of Hashem. What does this mean for us? It was in the Midbar Sinai, the wilderness of Sinai, that the Jewish people emerged as a nation which learned to pursue its destiny of serving God rather than serving ourselves. From the darkness of serving our own egos, they emerged into serving the will of Hashem, Ratzon Hashem. They transformed themselves from servants of Pharaoh and then servants of themselves to servants of God. But with the sins of the golden calf and the spies, they lost it. They lost that direction. And they wandered in the desert. And their task, as is our task, is to rediscover this pathway in the wilderness. We have to discover this pathway on our own. We have to discover and rediscover the light within the darkness and go from me'afela le'oira. And therefore, we have to move from the second pasuk of the Torah to the first pasuk of the Torah. The second pasuk of the Torah, the second verse of the Torah says, and the aretz was sohu vavo, the choshech al pnei sahom, and the earth was unformed and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. That's the darkness of Egypt. That's the darkness of the 10 spies, the darkness of the golden calf, the darkness of wilderness, of giving over ourselves to our ego, and the wilderness of the chush, of the nachash. That's the second pasuk. So vavohu, all unformed and void, and return to the first pasuk of the Torah, which is Breshis bar Elokim es hashamayim es aretz. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, which means He created destiny and He created artzius, a physical chush. And our job is to have our shamayim, our destiny, guide our physical dimension. The Avos, Avram, Yitzhak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, the Emmaus, started this legacy. And it's our job to finish it. How do we do that? In every Shmona Esrei, we say, Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu v'Elokei Avosenu, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov, Hakel hagadol hagibor v'hanora kel elyon, gomel chasadim toivim v'konei hakol v'zecher chasdei avos, umevi goel livnei v'neihem v'ma'an shemo be'ahava. We mentioned Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and their pathway in connecting with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in laying the cables of connection. And that is for us. We are the B'nai B'naihem. We are the children's children. We are their great-grandchildren. It's our task to follow that pathway, to find a pathway amidst our own chush, our own desires, our own aimless walking, and to walk directly toward the will of Hashem, following halacha, learning Torah, connecting with Hashem, and doing chesed, as did Lady J and Lord Jacobowitz, and as many in our community are doing. And our job is to be the children's children. We are the B'nai B'naihem. And we are tasked with the obligation and the opportunity to continue the journey of the Avos and the Imahos by finding our way out of the darkness of secularism and purposelessness toward Tsura, from Chomer to Tsura, from raw material to essence and purpose, and toward from Shamaima and from Shomema, and from Shmama, desolation, to Shamayim, from darkness and to light, from purposelessness to tachlis and destiny, by becoming servants of Hashem, of the Hashem.